An arrogant millionaire was showing off his luxury watch during an elegant dinner, bragging about the rare piece that belonged to his late father. Suddenly, his housekeeper interrupted the conversation and declared something that froze everyone present. That watch belonged to her father, but the truth was much more shocking. The millionaire was the father who had abandoned her years ago, and now the daughter he rejected was working as a maid in his own mansion. Comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. The iron gate opened with a metallic screech that echoed in Ava's chest like a warning. In front of her stood the most imposing mansion she had ever seen in her 23 years of life. 3 stories of white marble, enormous windows reflecting the morning sky, and perfectly manicured gardens that looked like they were straight out of a European magazine. It was the kind of place she had only seen in movies, the kind of wealth that had always seemed as distant as the moon. She gripped the handle of her worn-out bag tighter. Inside, she carried only the essentials: a change of clothes, her documents, and a folded photograph she never dared to look at for too long. Her shoes, the only presentable pair she owned, crunched softly against the gravel of the driveway. Each step brought her closer to that world of opulence, and each step also took her further away from the person she had been, until that moment. The main door opened before she could ring the bell. A woman with a stern face and an impeccable uniform looked her up and down with a gaze that evaluated every detail. "Ava Miller?" she asked in a sharp voice. "Yes, ma'am." "Good morning," Ava replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Mrs. Davis, the head of staff. You're on time. That's good. Mr. Blackwood doesn't tolerate tardiness. Follow me." But the interior of the mansion was even more impressive than the outside. The foyer had a crystal chandelier that hung from the ceiling like a waterfall of light, and the walls were adorned with paintings that were probably worth more than everything Ava had ever owned in her life. Her footsteps echoed against the marble floor, creating an echo that made her feel small, insignificant. "The rules are simple," Mrs. Davis said as they walked down a long hallway. "You'll start at 6 a.m., clean the downstairs rooms first, then the common areas, and finally Mr. Blackwood's study. Never touch his documents. Never enter when he's working, and above all, never interrupt him." Ava nodded, memorizing each instruction, but there was a question gnawing at her, a question she had rehearsed 1,000 times in front of the mirror in her room at the boarding house where she lived. "And Mr. Blackwood is demanding." Mrs. Davis stopped in front of a door and turned slowly. Her expression was hard to read, but there was something in her eyes that seemed like a mix of warning and pity. "Mr. Blackwood is a very busy man. He doesn't expect conversation. He doesn't expect smiles. He expects perfection. If you do your job without mistakes and without getting noticed, you'll do fine here. If you fail or try to get his attention, you won't last long." Ava's heart pounded harder. Without getting noticed. That was precisely the opposite of what she had come here to do, though Mrs. Davis would never know. The door opened to reveal a small but clean room, her staff quarters. A single bed, a wardrobe, a window overlooking the back garden. It was more than she had had in years, yet it felt like a cell. "Change and come down in 10 minutes. I'll show you your duties for the day." When Mrs. Davis left, Ava sat on the edge of the bed and let out the breath she had been holding. Her hands trembled slightly. She took the photograph out of her bag, a blurry image, almost worn out by the years of a young man smiling carelessly. On the back, written in faded blue ink, was the name Richard Blackwood, 1998. Her mother had kept that photo for years, hidden between the pages of an old book. She never looked at it, never talked about him, but she never got rid of it either. Ava had only found it after the funeral, when she had to sort through the few belongings her mother had left behind. "This is your father," her mother had told her only once in her last days in the hospital, her voice weakened by illness. "Richard Blackwood, the man who abandoned us before you were born, the man who chose his money over us." Ava put the photograph away, again changed into the gray uniform they had given her, and looked at herself in the small mirror hanging on the wall. Her dark eyes, inherited from her mother, stared back with determination. She had come here with a purpose. She had lied on her job application. She had given false references. She had done everything necessary to get this job, and now that she was inside, she couldn't back down. She wanted to see him. She wanted him to see her. She wanted answers to the questions that had tormented her entire life. Why had he abandoned them? Did he ever think of them? Did he feel anything, even a shred of guilt? She went downstairs, following Mrs. Davis's instructions. Her heart hammered in her chest with every step. She knew that at any moment she could run into him, her father, the man she had never met. The man who, according to her mother, didn't even know she existed, or worse, did know and simply didn't care. Mrs. Davis was waiting for her in the kitchen, where she had already prepared a cart with cleaning supplies. "You'll start with the main living room. Every surface must be spotless. Mr. Blackwood has important guests this week, and everything must be perfect." As she pushed the cart toward the living room, Ava heard a man's voice coming from the upper floor. It was deep, authoritative, the kind of voice used to giving orders and being obeyed. Her entire body tensed. "I need those documents this afternoon. How is it possible they're not ready yet?" the voice shouted with evident irritation. "I don't care about your excuses. I want results, not explanations." Ava stopped dead in her tracks, her fingers gripping the handle of the cart until her knuckles turned white. That was his voice, the voice of Richard Blackwood, the voice of her father. And in that moment, for the first time in her life, Ava truly understood what she had come to face, not just a rich and distant man, but a ghost that had haunted her thoughts since she could remember. A ghost that now had a name, a face, and a voice. A ghost she would meet for the first time in a matter of minutes. The main living room was a museum of wealth Italian leather sofas, Persian rugs that were probably worth more than Ava's annual salary, and an art collection hanging on the walls with a studied elegance. Every object screamed money, power, success. It was the kind of place where people like her only entered to clean, never to belong. Ava began to dust the surfaces with mechanical movements, but her mind was elsewhere. The footsteps on the upper floor had ceased, and now a tense silence reigned, making her even more nervous. She knew that at any moment he could come down. At any moment she would have to look him in the eye. Would he recognize her? Would he see something of her mother in her face? Or would she just be another invisible employee to him? Another piece of furniture that kept his world running without him having to think about it? "You. The new one." The voice came from behind, sharp as a knife. Ava turned slowly and saw him in person for the first time. Richard Blackwood was 45, but he looked younger. His dark hair had some gray at the temples that gave him a distinguished air. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, and his gray eyes, the same eyes Ava saw in the mirror every morning, watched her with absolute indifference. There was no recognition in that gaze. There was nothing but a cold evaluation, as if he were inspecting a new piece of furniture. "Yes, sir," Ava replied, and she hated how her voice had trembled slightly. "When you clean this room, make sure the glass surfaces have no streaks. The last person left smudges everywhere, and don't touch the paintings, just dust the floor." "Understood, sir." Richard walked to the window, turned his back to her completely, and took out his cell phone. For him, the conversation was over. Ava had ceased to exist on his radar. She was just another employee, as relevant as the wallpaper. Something twisted inside Ava's chest, a mixture of rage and pain she had tried to keep buried for weeks while preparing for this encounter. There he was, meters away, the man whose blood ran through her veins, the man who had abandoned her mother when she was pregnant, who had never asked if she was okay, if she had food, if she had a place to sleep. And now he looked at her as if she were less than nothing. Her fingers tightened on the duster with such force that she felt she could break it, but she forced herself to breathe, to continue cleaning, to maintain her composure. She couldn't explode now. Not yet. She had come here with a plan, and she needed to stick to it. Richard made a phone call, speaking in an authoritative tone about business mergers and millions of dollars, while Ava cleaned around him like a shadow. He didn't look at her again, not once. He simply continued his conversation, pacing back and forth across the room, as if he were completely alone. When he finally hung up the phone, he headed for the door without a word. But just before leaving, he stopped and spoke without even turning around. "Mrs. Davis told me you're efficient. I hope that's true. I don't tolerate mediocrity in my house." And he left. Ava stood there motionless, feeling tears threaten to overflow. But she held them back. She had held them back for 23 years. She could hold them back a little longer. The next few hours passed in a mechanical routine. She cleaned room after room, each more opulent than the last. Mrs. Davis supervised her with a critical eye, correcting every small mistake, ensuring everything was perfect by Mr. Blackwood's impossible standards. "The study is the last thing you'll clean each day," Mrs. Davis informed her when they arrived in front of a carved wooden door on the second floor. "It's his sanctuary. If anything is out of place in there, you'll be gone that day. Do you understand, Mrs.?" Davis opened the door with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. The study was impressive. Walls lined with books, a massive mahogany desk, leather chairs and windows that offered a panoramic view of the garden. But what immediately caught Ava's attention was the glass display case in the corner. Inside, under a soft light that highlighted its importance, rested an antique pocket watch. It was gold, with engraved details on the cover, and it hung from a chain that gleamed as if it were new. Even from a distance, Ava could see it was a valuable piece, the kind of object passed down from generation to generation. Something inside her stirred violently. "That watch," Mrs. Davis said, noticing her gaze. "It's Mr. Blackwood's most prized possession. It belonged to his father. Never under any circumstances open that display case. Just clean the glass on the outside. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear," Ava murmured, but she couldn't take her eyes off the watch. There was something about that object, something that made her heart beat faster, that made her hands start to tremble. It was as if a forgotten part of her memory was trying to awaken, as if that watch meant something more than just a family heirloom. "Ava, are you listening to me?" "Yes. Sorry. It's just beautiful. Beautiful and out of your reach. Now start over here." Ava worked in the study with trembling hands. Every time she passed near the display case, she felt a magnetic pull toward that watch. Why did it seem so familiar? Why did she feel that if she could just get closer, if she could see it better, she would understand something important? Mrs. Davis finally left, leaving her alone to finish. Ava stood motionless in front of the display case, looking at the watch with an intensity that almost hurt. In the silence of the study, she could hear the beating of her own heart, fast and erratic. She reached her hand toward the glass, not to open it, but just to touch it. Her fingers brushed against the cold, transparent surface, and in that moment, a flash of memory hit her like a lightning bolt. Her mother in the hospital, her voice weak, and her eyes full of tears. He had a watch, a gold watch his father had given him. He wore it always. He said it was the most valuable thing he owned. When he left me, he took everything, even that damned watch. Ava's world tilted. Her legs buckled, and she had to hold on to the desk to keep from falling. It was possible. It could be the same watch. "What are you doing in here?" Richard Blackwood's voice made her spin around so sharply that she almost knocked over a vase on the desk. He was standing in the doorway watching her with a mixture of suspicion and annoyance. I was cleaning, sir. Mrs. Davis told me to." Richard walked toward her with measured steps. Ava backed away instinctively, her back hitting the display case. He stopped a few feet away, and for the first time, he truly looked her in the eye. It was just for a second of direct eye contact. But in that second, Ava felt the entire world freeze. She saw something, a flicker of recognition, a spark of something that went beyond indifference. But then Richard looked away, as if the eye contact had been too uncomfortable, too intimate for someone of his position with someone like her. "Finish up and get out. I don't want to see you in here when I get back." He left the study, closing the door with more force than necessary. Ava stood there, trembling, tears finally streaming down her cheeks. For the first time in her life, she had been just feet away from her father. She had looked him in the eye, and to him, she was nothing more than an insignificant nuisance. But that watch, that damned watch, changed everything. The days turned into a routine of calculated invisibility. Ava quickly learned Richard Blackwood's patterns of movement when he came down for breakfast, when he left for his meetings, when he returned at night. She learned to move through the mansion like a ghost, always present, but never noticed, always working, but never acknowledged. Richard never looked at her directly again after that first day. When they passed in the hallways, he simply kept walking as if she didn't exist. When he needed something, he gave orders through Mrs. Davis, never directly to her. It was as if Ava were an abstract concept of the Maid, not a real person with a face and a name. Each act of indifference was a stab wound. Every time he passed by without seeing her, Ava felt a part of herself crumble a little more, but she forced herself to carry on, to smile, when Mrs. Davis gave her instructions to keep her head down and her hands busy. At night, in her small staff room, Ava would take the worn photograph from her bag and mentally compare it to the man she saw every day. The features were the same. The strong jawline, the shape of the eyes, the bone structure of the face, but there was something profoundly different. The carefree young man in the photo had been replaced by a man of ice, incapable of seeing beyond his own world of power and money. What had happened to him? Had he always been like this? Or had life hardened him into this cold, inaccessible version of himself? One afternoon, while cleaning the dining room, she heard voices coming from the adjacent living room. Richard was meeting with someone, speaking in a more relaxed tone than he usually used. Ava, betraying her own rules not to pry, crept silently to the slightly ajar door. "The deal with the Japanese is closed," Richard was saying. "It's $300 million. My father would be proud." "Your father was always proud of you, Richard," replied a male voice Ava didn't recognize. "You built an empire on top of what he started." "What he started was a modest business. I turned it into this." There was pride in Richard's voice, but also something else. Bitterness, resentment. "And your personal life?" the visitor asked. "Ever think about settling down? You're 45, my friend. Most men your age already have a family." A heavy silence followed. Ava held her breath, pressing her ear against the crack in the door. "Family is a distraction," Richard finally replied, with a coldness that chilled Ava's blood. I saw what it did to my father. His whole life dedicated to pleasing my mother, to making sure I had the best. He worked himself to death for us. And for what he died of a heart attack before he could enjoy what he had built. But that's exactly the reason to have a family, to have someone to work for. I work for myself. I don't need emotional baggage that makes me weak. The words fell on Ava like stones. Emotional baggage. That's how he saw relationships, human connections. That's how he had probably seen her mother when she told him she was pregnant. A burden, an obstacle, something to be disposed of. Rage bubbled in her throat, but she swallowed it down with effort. She couldn't make a scene. Not yet. She heard footsteps approaching and quickly moved away from the door, returning to her work of cleaning the dining room table. Richard and his visitor came out of the living room, passed her without a glance, and headed for the front door. "Give my regards to your family," the visitor said as he left. "I will," Richard replied automatically, closing the door. When he turned, he finally noticed Ava's presence. He frowned slightly. "How long have you been here?" "I just arrived, sir. I came to clean the dining room." He watched her for a moment longer than usual, as if trying to determine if she was lying. Ava kept her expression neutral, her eyes lowered, her posture submissive. After what felt like an eternity, Richard simply nodded and walked away toward his study. That night, Ava couldn't sleep. Richard's words echoed in her mind over and over, emotional baggage. That's how he had seen her, as a burden he had never wanted. Her mother had spent years telling her that her father had simply been young and irresponsible, that he had probably been scared at the prospect of being a father. But now Ava understood it was much worse than that. He had consciously chosen his career, his money, his freedom over them. He had chosen not to have emotional baggage. She wondered if he ever thought about her mother, if he ever wondered what had become of her, if he felt even a shred of curiosity or guilt. Probably not. For men like Richard Blackwood, the past was just that. Past. There was no room for remorse in his world of steel and calculated coldness. But Ava was determined to change that. She was determined to make him see, to make him remember, to make him feel, if only for a moment, the pain he had caused. 3 weeks passed before Ava had her first real chance to get closer to the truth. Mrs. Davis had left early that morning for a family emergency, leaving Ava in charge of cleaning without supervision. Richard had gone to a meeting that, from what she overheard, would last most of the day. The house was quiet. A silence that to Ava felt heavy with secrets waiting to be discovered. She went up the stairs to the study, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was breaking the rules, that if she were caught, she could be fired immediately. But something stronger than fear pushed her forward. She needed to see that watch up close. She needed to confirm her suspicions. The study door was unlocked. She entered silently, closing it behind her. The room smelled of leather and polished wood, of money and power. She walked directly to the display case, where the watch rested, illuminated by the soft light that made it gleam like a treasure. Her hands trembled as she took out the small key she had seen Mrs. Davis use days before. She had borrowed it that morning, knowing this might be her only chance. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the glass door opened with an almost imperceptible click. Ava reached for the watch, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. She lifted it carefully, feeling its weight in her palm. It was beautiful, undeniably beautiful, with intricate engravings on the cover and a chain that seemed to have never lost its shine. With trembling hands, she opened the cover. The internal mechanism was perfectly preserved, the gears moving with a precision that spoke of quality and care. But what made Ava's heart stop was what she saw on the inside of the cover. A small, delicate inscription engraved in the metal with elegant calligraphy, "For my little star, who lit up my life when it was darkest. Dad, 1998. The world spun. 1998. The year she was born, the year her mother had been pregnant, the year her father had disappeared. Her fingers traced the engraved letters, feeling every curve, every line. My little star, would he have called her that if he had known her? Had he engraved this thinking of her, the daughter he would never know? Or a darker thought crept into her mind? Had he engraved this for someone else? Did Richard have another family, another daughter whom he had chosen? Tears began to fall without her being able to control them. She held the watch against her chest, feeling the cold metal press against her racing heart. This watch was the proof that her mother had been telling the truth, the proof that Richard Blackwood had had a connection with them, however brief. But it was also proof of his abandonment that he had chosen to keep this watch, to display it like a trophy, while she and her mother struggled to survive in a one-room apartment where water leaked through the ceiling when it rained. "What the hell are you doing?" Richard's voice exploded in the room like thunder. Ava spun around abruptly, nearly dropping the watch. He was in the doorway, his face transformed by fury. His gray eyes, normally so cold and distant, now burned with an anger Ava had never seen. I'm sorry, give me that." Richard crossed the room in 3 long strides and snatched the watch from her hands. "How dare you! How dare you touch this!" His voice was a roar, and Ava instinctively backed away, bumping into the desk. She had never seen him like this. The mask of indifference had completely cracked, revealing something raw and furious underneath. "Sir, I didn't mean to. I was just cleaning and—" "Liar." Richard slammed the display case shut with a bang that made the glass tremble. "The case was open. The key is in your hand. Do you think I'm an idiot?" Ava looked at her hand and saw that she was indeed still holding the small key to the display case. The evidence of her transgression was undeniable. "Get out. Pack your things and get out right now." The words were like a slap. Ava felt something inside her break for good. Not like this. It couldn't end like this. She had come here for answers, and she wouldn't leave without them. "Why is this watch so important to you?" she asked, her voice breaking but firm. Richard turned slowly toward her, his expression one of total disbelief. "Excuse me, the inscription, the date, everything. Why is it so important? That is none of your business. Now get out of my house before I call the police." "It was your father who had it engraved, wasn't it?" Ava continued, knowing she was risking everything, but unable to stop. "The year I was born, I mean the year engraved. What happened that year?" Richard's face hardened even more, if that was possible. "I don't know who the hell you think you are, but you have no right to ask me anything. This watch belonged to my father. He gave it to me before he died. It's all I have left of him. And you, a thief, dared to touch it." "I'm not a thief," Ava said, tears now streaming freely. "I just wanted to see it up close. I just wanted—" "Silence! I'll call Mrs. Davis to escort you out, and you can forget about any references. I'll let every employment agency in the city know you're a thief. You'll never get a job in a decent house again." He turned to leave, but Ava, desperate, took a step forward. "My mother knew him." She cried out the words, tumbling out before she could stop them. "Years ago, you knew her." Richard stopped in his tracks. He turned slowly, his expression now a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "What did you say?" Ava took a deep breath. This was the moment when everything would change for better or for worse. "My mother, Eleanor Miller. You met her in 1997. She worked at a cafe near your university." She saw something flicker in Richard's eyes. Recognition or just confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about. I never knew anyone by that name." "She had black hair and dark eyes. She was 3 years younger than you. You were together, and then you disappeared." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at her, his anger momentarily replaced by something more complex. Ava could see the gears turning in his mind, searching his memory, trying to make sense of her words. "There are many women in this world," he finally said, his voice lower, but still sharp. "I can't remember everyone I met decades ago. But she remembered you. She remembered you until the day she died." Something shifted in Richard's face, a tiny crack in his armor. "She died 3 months ago. Cancer. She didn't have money for treatment. She worked until she could no longer stand on her feet. And in her last days, she told me about you, about the man who had left her pregnant and disappeared without looking back." The color drained from Richard's face. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He staggered slightly, as if Ava's words were physical blows. "No, that's impossible." "Why?" "Because men like you don't face consequences. Because you can leave women pregnant and just go on with your lives as if nothing happened." I never knew." "You didn't know, or you didn't want to know." Ava took another step closer, her fear now completely replaced by years of repressed rage. "She tried to contact you. She looked for you, but you had changed your number. You had moved. It was as if you had erased every trace of your former life." Richard collapsed into his desk chair, his face now as pale as wax. Ava saw his hands tremble slightly as he rested them on the wooden surface. "If this is true, if she really, why did she never tell me? She tried, but you were already gone. And when she finally had me, she decided it was better to raise me alone than to keep looking for a man who clearly didn't want to be found." Richard looked up, and for the first time, Ava saw something other than coldness in his eyes. She saw confusion, shock, and perhaps fear. "So you're saying you're her daughter?" "Yes. Ava Eleanor Miller, 23 years old, born on March 15th, 1998, 9 months after you disappeared from my mother's life." The watch in the display case seemed to mark every second of the silence that followed each tick, resonating in the space between them, like a countdown to something inevitable. Richard remained motionless for what felt like an eternity. His breathing was uneven. His eyes were fixed on Ava, as if seeing her for the first time, and perhaps, in a way, he was. This has to be a scam," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "You come here and invent some elaborate story steal from my house." "It's not a story," Ava interrupted, pulling something from her pocket. "I have proof." She held out the worn photograph, the same one she had kept for years. Richard took it with trembling hands. His eyes widened as he recognized his own image, young and innocent, smiling at the camera, with a carelessness that had long since vanished. "Oh my God," he murmured. "I remember when this picture was taken. It was in 1997. My mother took it. She said it was her favorite day together. You went to the park, ate ice cream, talked about dreams and the future, and then 2 weeks later you disappeared." Richard dropped the photo on the desk as if it burned. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of distress Ava had never seen in him. "You don't understand. My father had just died. I was a wreck. I had to take over the business. I had responsibilities. You had a responsibility to my mother too, and to me, and to—" "I didn't know you existed," Richard exploded, standing up abruptly. "If I had known, what would you have come back? Would you have helped?" "Don't make me laugh. You said it yourself. Family is emotional baggage. Commitments make you weak. Do you really expect me to believe you would have acted differently if you had known?" The words hit Richard like punches. He sank back into the chair, his face now buried in his hands. "I met your mother at a cafe," he said, after a long silence, his voice now distant as if speaking from far away. "She was a waitress. She had the most beautiful smile I had ever seen. It was like a breath of fresh air in the middle of the chaos of losing my father." Ava felt something tighten in her chest hearing him speak of her mother that way. "We were together for 3 months. They were the only happy months after my father died. But then my mother pressured me. The business was falling apart. I needed to focus. I needed to be strong. And Eleanor, she represented everything opposite. She was soft, vulnerable, and I couldn't afford to be vulnerable at that moment." "So you left her?" "I stopped answering her calls. I changed my number, moved. I thought she would understand, that she would move on with her life. I never imagined she could have gotten pregnant." "Because you never asked. You never bothered to find out." Richard looked up, and Ava saw tears in his eyes for the first time. Tears he seemed desperate to hold back. "You're right. I was a coward. I ran from everything that could make me feel something. And that cowardice cost her and you everything." Silence fell between them again, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence heavy with tension and rage, but a heavier one, laden with painful truths and lost opportunities. "The watch," Ava said, finally pointing to the display case. The inscription, "For my little star." "Who was it for?" Richard turned to the display case, his expression now filled with deep pain. "For no one. My father had it engraved thinking of me. He always called me his little star when I was a boy. He had it made shortly before he died. It was his way of telling me he believed in me, that he knew I would light up the world with my achievements." He stood up and walked to the display case, opening the door with trembling hands. He took the watch and held it with a reverence Ava immediately recognized. It was the same way she had held her mother's photograph all these years. "But look what I did with that light," Richard continued, his voice breaking. "I built an empire, made millions, but in the process, I left a woman to raise my daughter alone. I let the two of you suffer while I lived in this mansion. What kind of light is that? The kind that comes from darkness," Ava replied softly. "My mother used to say that stars only shine in the darkest night." Richard looked at her, and in that moment Ava saw something she never thought she would, her father truly seeing her not as an employee, not as a problem, but as a person. As his daughter. "What was she like?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. "Your mother? What was her life like?" Ava felt the lump in her throat tighten. There were so many things to say, so many years of suffering to summarize. Hard. Her life was hard. She worked as a waitress, a cleaner, whatever it took to feed us. We never lacked food, though she sometimes went days eating only bread. She sent me to school even when we couldn't afford the books. She made sure I had new shoes every school year, even if hers were torn. Tears were streaming freely down Ava's cheeks now. And when she got sick, she kept working, kept smiling. She kept telling me everything would be okay, even when we both knew it wouldn't. She died in a public hospital because we couldn't afford a private one. And in her last moments, what hurt her most wasn't the cancer. It was knowing I would be left alone in the world. Richard closed his eyes, tears escaping from between his closed eyelids. His shoulders shook with a silent cry that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. Your apologies won't bring her back. I know, and that's killing me." Ava watched him cry. This powerful, cold man, now reduced to a human being, broken by the weight of his own decisions. Part of her wanted to feel satisfaction. She wanted to see this as a victory, but instead she only felt a deep emptiness. "Why did you come here?" Richard asked finally, wiping his tears. "Why didn't you just confront me from the start?" "Because I needed to understand who you were. I needed to see if you were worth having a father. And frankly, I discovered you're not. You're exactly the man my mother described, cold, distant, incapable of loving anyone but yourself and your money." The words were cruel, but Richard didn't defend himself. He simply nodded, accepting the verdict as if it were a just sentence. "You're right. That's the man I became. But I need you to know that I wasn't always like this, and maybe it's not too late to change." "Change?" Ava laughed bitterly. "You've been this person for 45 years. You don't change overnight." "I know, but would you give me a chance to try? I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't expect you to suddenly see me as a father. But at least let me try to make amends even for a fraction of the damage I caused." Ava looked at him for a long moment. She had come here seeking confrontation, seeking to make him pay for the pain he had caused. But now that he was in front of her, broken and regretful, she didn't know what to feel. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted. "I don't know if I can look at you and see anything other than the man who abandoned my mother." "Then don't," Richard said, his voice firm, despite the tears. "Look at me and see the man who wants to try to be better, the man you just woke up from an empty and meaningless life." A long silence ensued. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, tinging the study in shades of orange and gold. The watch in the display case marked the seconds, each one seeming more important than the last. "Stay," Richard said finally. "Not as an employee. As my guest. Give me time to process this. Give me time to show you that I can be more than the monster you see now." Ava closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders. She could leave now, leave this house and this man behind, return to her simple life with the satisfaction of having revealed the truth. Or she could stay and risk being disappointed once more. "1 week," she said finally. "I'll give you 1 week to prove to me that you're worth knowing. But if at any point I see the cold, arrogant man who treated me like trash these past few days, again I will leave, and you will never see me again." Richard nodded, a spark of something like hope lighting up his eyes. 1 week. I promise I won't waste it." As Ava left the study, she felt the world tilt slightly under her feet. She had come here for answers, and she had found them. But in the process, she had opened a door to possibilities she had never imagined, possibilities that terrified her as much as they intrigued her. The first morning after the revelation was strange, in a way Ava couldn't quite describe. She woke up in her small staff room, but when she went down for breakfast, she found that Mrs. Davis had set a place for her in the main dining room, not in the kitchen as usual. "Mr. Blackwood left specific instructions," Mrs. Davis explained with an expression that mixed confusion and disapproval. "From today on, you will take your meals here." Ava sat uncomfortably in one of the elegant chairs, feeling the weight of the situation. The dining room was an intimidating space with its long table that could easily seat 20 people, and its crystal glassware that probably cost more than her mother's entire annual salary. Richard entered a few minutes later. Ava immediately noticed he looked different. His eyes were swollen and red as if he hadn't slept all night. His suit, normally impeccable, was slightly wrinkled. It was as if the armor of perfection he always wore had begun to crack. "Good morning," he said with uncertainty, as if unsure how to behave. "Good morning," Ava replied, equally uncomfortable. They sat at opposite ends of the table, the distance between them seeming to symbolize the 23 years of separation. Mrs. Davis served breakfast in a tense silence: eggs toast, fresh fruit coffee. Ava ate mechanically each bite, seeming to get stuck in her throat. "I called my lawyer last night," Richard said, finally breaking the silence. "I asked him to investigate. I need to confirm everything. Not because I doubt you, but because I need the facts. I need to fully understand what happened." Ava nodded. It was reasonable, she supposed, though the request stung her in some way. "I also want to do a DNA test. If you really are my daughter, I want there to be no doubt for either of us." Silence fell again. Richard fidgeted with his coffee, his fingers drumming nervously against the porcelain cup. "Tell me about yourself," he said suddenly. "I know nothing about you. Your interests, your dreams, what you like to do. Tell me." Ava looked at him with suspicion. Was this real or just a show? "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care now?" "Because I spent 23 years not knowing you existed, and now that I do, I don't want to waste another second." There was something in his voice, a raw sincerity Ava hadn't heard before. She sighed and put down her fork. "I like to read. I used to go to the library every day after school because it was free and had heat in the winter. I graduated with honors from high school, though I could never go to college because we needed the money. I've been working since I was 16. I've been a waitress, a cashier, a cleaner, whatever was necessary to help my mother." Each word seemed to hit Richard physically. His shoulders slumped lower with each revelation. "And now, what do you want to do with your life?" Ava laughed bitterly. "Survive. That's all I've been doing for years, surviving." "But if you could do anything, if money were no object, what would you do?" The question took her by surprise. No one had ever asked her that. Money had always been an issue, so dreaming of the impossible had never seemed productive. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I've never allowed myself to think about it." Richard stood up from his chair and walked toward her, shortening the distance between them. He stopped a few steps away, as if afraid to get too close and scare her off. "Then think about it. You have a whole life ahead of you now, Ava. And I want to help you live it the way you deserve." "I don't want your money," she replied quickly, almost defensively. "I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about opportunities, about choices, about giving you the chance to choose instead of just surviving." Ava felt tears threaten to fall again. It was too much. Everything was too much. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Why are you acting like you care now?" "Because I do care. I know I have no right to say that. I know I wasn't there when you needed me, but you're here now, and I'm here. And maybe that means something." Before Ava could answer, the dining room door burst open. Mrs. Davis entered with an urgent expression. "Mr. Blackwood, you have an important call. Mr. Martinez from Tokyo. He says it's urgent." Richard looked at Mrs. Davis, then at Ava, clearly torn. "Tell him I'll call back later." Mrs. Davis blinked in surprise. "Sir, it's about the $300 million deal. He insists on speaking with you now." "Then he'll have to wait. I'm busy." Mrs. Davis's expression was one of absolute shock. In all the years she had worked for Richard, she had never seen him postpone a business call, let alone one involving so much money. When Mrs. Davis left, Richard turned to Ava with a small smile. "See, I'm already changing." But Ava wasn't convinced. One gesture didn't undo years of abandonment. One shared meal didn't erase the pain of growing up without a father. "I want to see where we lived," she said suddenly. "My mother and I. I want you to see the apartment where I grew up, to see the streets where she worked until her feet bled. I want you to see the hospital where she died alone while you slept in your silk sheets." Richard paled at the rawness of her words. "Ava, no. If you really want to know me, if you really want to understand, then you have to see where I come from. I can't show you my mother, but I can show you the world she left me." There was a moment of silence as Richard processed the request. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right. Show me. Show me everything." 2 hours later, they were in Richard's car, a black BMW that probably cost more than her mother had earned in her entire life. Ava gave directions in a low voice, guiding him through neighborhoods that became progressively poorer as they moved away from his mansion. They finally arrived at a dilapidated building on the east side of the city. The paint was peeling from the walls, the windows were cracked, and the smell of dampness was unmistakable even from the outside. "Here," Ava said. "Third-floor apartment 3B. They climbed the stairs, which creaked dangerously under their feet. Richard said nothing, but Ava could see his eyes widening as he took in the state of the place. He had probably never been in a building like this in his entire life. The apartment was empty now. The few pieces of furniture they had owned had been sold to pay for her mother's funeral. It was just an empty, small, and desolate space, but for Ava, memories filled every corner. This was the living room, dining room, and kitchen. All in one, Ava explained, her voice distant. "That's where my mother cooked. Sometimes we had to choose between paying the electricity bill or buying food. So many nights we ate in the dark." She moved toward a narrow doorway. "This was our bedroom. We shared a bed until I turned 12. Then my mother started sleeping on the sofa so I could have more space." Richard walked behind her, as if in a trance, touching the walls, looking out the dirty windows that faced a dark alley. "The bathroom is over there. The hot water worked maybe 3 days a week. In the winter, we'd take cold showers or none at all." Finally, Ava stopped in the center of the empty room and turned to Richard. Tears were streaming down her face, but her voice was strong. "This was our world. While you lived in your mansion with your servants and your expensive art, we lived here. While you were deciding which $1,000 suit to wear, my mother was mending my only school skirt with thread she had unraveled from an old shirt. While you dined in fancy restaurants, we split a can of soup between the two of us." Richard had slumped against the wall, silent tears rolling down his cheeks. "I didn't know," he whispered. "Oh my God, I didn't know." "But you could have known. If you had answered a single call, if you had replied to a single letter, if you had had even a little bit of curiosity about what you left behind." "You're right. You're absolutely right. I have no excuse. I have nothing to say that can justify this." Ava moved closer to him, her eyes shining with a mixture of rage and pain. "My mother died thinking she wasn't good enough for you. She died believing you chose money over us because we weren't worth enough. Do you have any idea what that did to her, how she saw herself?" "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," Richard choked out. "If I could turn back time." "But you can't. Time is gone, my mother is gone, and I have to live with the knowledge that my father was miles away living in luxury while we were barely surviving." A long, painful silence followed. Outside, the sounds of traffic and city life continued indifferent to the drama unfolding in that empty apartment. "What can I do?" Richard asked finally, his voice broken. "Tell me, what can I do to fix this? Anything." "I don't know if there's anything you can do, but if you really want to try, start by being the man my mother needed you to be. Not for me now, but in honor of her memory. Prove that her life wasn't wasted loving someone who didn't deserve it." Richard nodded, wiping his tears with trembling hands. "I will. I promise you. I will spend the rest of my life trying." As they walked down the building's stairs, Ava felt something shift inside her. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But maybe it was the beginning of something. The beginning of an understanding that people were complex, that mistakes could be monumental, and yet, maybe there could still be room for redemption. Perhaps. The following days were an awkward dance of cautious approach and protective distance. Richard canceled meetings, postponed business trips, and dedicated every available moment to being near Ava, though she still wasn't ready to call him father. The DNA test results arrived on the 4th day. Richard opened the envelope with trembling hands, while Ava watched from the living room sofa. His eyes scanned the official document, and when he finally looked up, tears were streaming down his face. 99.99% probability, he read aloud. You're my daughter. Officially, scientifically, indisputably. Ava nodded without surprise. She had always known, but seeing it written down officially hit her differently. She was no longer just the abandoned daughter of a dead woman. She was Ava Blackwood, daughter of one of the city's wealthiest businessmen. I want to host a dinner, Richard said, suddenly wiping his tears. I want you to meet the important people in my life, my business partners, my friends. I want them to know you exist. Why? Ava asked suspiciously. To prove you're doing the right thing for your public image. Because for 23 years, you've been invisible to me. And I want the world to know that you're not anymore. I want them to know I have a daughter, and that I'm proud of her. The word proud resonated strangely in Ava's ears. How could he be proud of someone he barely knew? You don't know me well enough to be proud. I know you survived when everything was against you. I know you took care of your mother until her last days. I know you were brave enough to come here and confront me. That's more than enough to be proud of. Despite herself, Ava felt something warm blossom in her chest. They were the words she had longed to hear her entire life, and now that she was finally hearing them, she didn't know how to process them. The dinner was arranged for Saturday night. Richard hired a private chef and decorators and made sure everything was perfect. Ava watched the preparations with a mixture of fascination and horror. The money spent on a single night could have fed her and her mother for months. Is this what you normally do? She asked, as she watched the decorators install floral arrangements that probably cost hundreds of dollars. Spend money on such frivolous things. Richard, who was reviewing the menu with the chef, looked up. I used to do it without a second thought. Now it makes me sick. To think of all the money I've wasted on meaningless things while you and your mother... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. But tonight is important, he continued. It's not for frivolity. It's because I want to celebrate you. I want you to feel, if only for one night, what it's like to be valued and celebrated. Ava didn't know how to respond to that. On the day of the dinner, a stylist showed up with suitcases full of dresses. Richard insisted that Ava choose something for the occasion. I don't need new clothes, Ava protested. I have a presentable dress. Please let me do this. Let me give you something. The expression on his face was so vulnerable, so needy, that Ava finally relented. She chose a dark blue dress, elegant, but not too flashy. When she tried it on and looked in the mirror, she almost didn't recognize herself. She looked like someone who belonged in this world, and that terrified her. The guests began to arrive at 8 p.m. Ava watched them from the second-floor landing, her anxiety growing with each person who entered. They were people of money. That was obvious from the way they dressed, moved, and spoke. They were the kind of people who would have never noticed someone like her on the street. Ready? Richard asked, appearing at her side. Neither am I, but let's do it anyway. He offered her his arm. Ava looked at him for a long moment before finally taking it. Together they descended the stairs, and the murmur of conversation stopped as the guests noticed their arrival. Richard cleared his throat, clearly nervous. Thank you all for coming tonight. I've gathered you here because I have an important announcement to make, something that changes, well, everything. The silence in the room was absolute. All eyes were fixed on Richard and the young woman by his side. This is Ava, Ava Miller, and she is my daughter. The shock was palpable. Some guests exchanged disbelieving glances, others simply stood with their mouths agape. I know it's a surprise, Richard continued, his voice gaining strength. It was a surprise for me, too. A few days ago, I discovered that 23 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I abandoned a woman who loved me, and in the process, I abandoned the daughter I didn't even know existed. Ava could feel everyone's eyes piercing her, evaluating her, judging her. Her instinct was to run, to hide, to become invisible again, but something kept her in place. Ava has lived a life that I can't even imagine. She has suffered hardship, and despite all of it, she had the courage to come here and confront me with the truth. She is stronger and braver than anyone else in this room. Richard turned to her, his eyes shining with emotion. And I want everyone to know that from this day forward, I will do everything in my power to make up for the years I stole from her to be the father I should have been, from the beginning. The silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly one of the guests began to clap, then another and another, until the entire room was applauding, though Ava wasn't sure if it was out of genuine approval or just social courtesy. The dinner that followed was surreal. Ava sat at the head of the table next to Richard as a procession of gourmet dishes was served. The guests bombarded her with questions about her life, her interests, her plans. Some seemed genuinely interested, others just morbidly curious. "So, my dear," said an older woman with too much jewelry, "what do you plan to do now? I imagine your life will change quite a bit." "I don't know," Ava replied. "Honestly, this is all very overwhelming." "Well, with a father like Richard, doors will open for you. You could go to any university, work at any company. The world is your oyster now." There was something in the woman's tone that bothered Ava, as if Richard's money was the only reason she was now worth something. "With all due respect," Ava said, her voice cooler, "I've always had a world. It was just a different world from yours. And that world taught me things that no expensive university could ever teach. It taught me about resilience, about sacrifice, about loving unconditionally, even when life is cruel." The woman blinked, surprised by the direct response. Richard, however, was smiling with pride. Later that night, after all the guests had left, Ava and Richard sat on the terrace looking out at the city lights below them. "You did amazing tonight," Richard said. "I didn't feel amazing. I felt like an animal in a zoo exhibit." "I know, and I'm sorry. But I also wanted you to see that I'm not hiding you, that I'm not ashamed of you." Ava turned her head to look at him. "And what happens when the novelty wears off? When your friends stop asking about me? When you realize that having a daughter is more complicated than just announcing her at a fancy dinner?" Richard turned to her, taking her hands in his. Ava tensed at the contact but didn't pull away. "Then I'll still be here. I'll still be trying. I'll still be learning to be your father. No matter how long it takes, no matter how many times I fail, I won't give up on you, Ava. Not this time." Ava wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But years of abandonment and pain had built walls around her heart that wouldn't be easily torn down. "Time will tell," she finally replied gently, withdrawing her hands. Richard nodded, accepting the rejection with grace. "Time will tell, and I'll be here for every second of it." As they looked out at the city together in silence, Ava felt something subtly shift. It wasn't trust, not yet. But maybe it was the beginning of a possibility, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new on the ruins of the past. The week Ava had promised passed without either of them really noticing. The days turned into 2 weeks, then 3. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic between them began to change. Richard started asking her about her days, her thoughts, her opinions, and most surprisingly, he actually listened to the answers. He canceled a major merger to take her to a museum she mentioned she had never visited. He learned to make coffee the way she liked it. Small gestures that, when accumulated, began to mean something. But not everything was simple. There were moments of tension, of mistrust, of painful memories that surfaced without warning. One afternoon, Ava was in the mansion's library, a space she had discovered and which had become her sanctuary. She was reading when Richard came in with a box in his hands. "I found these," he said, approaching cautiously. "Photo albums from when I was young. I thought maybe you'd want to see them." Ava closed her book and watched as he placed the box on the table between them. Richard took out the first album and began to turn the pages. "This was me at your age," he said, pointing to a photo. "With my father at the opening of his first store." The photo showed a young Richard smiling broadly with an arm around an older man who was clearly his father. There was an undeniable resemblance among the three of them, the grandfather she never knew, Richard, and herself. "You look alike," Ava observed. "Yes, and you look like him too. You have his eyes, his determination too, according to what my mother used to say." Richard turned more pages, birthdays, graduations, family trips, a privileged life documented in perfect photographs. "My father was a good man," Richard said in a soft voice. "He worked too much, but he always found time for me. He taught me everything he knew about business, about ethics, about being honorable." "So what happened?" Ava asked, her voice harder than she intended. "How did you go from being the son of an honorable man to someone who abandons a pregnant woman?" Richard closed the album slowly, his face clouding over. "When my father died, something in me broke. I was 21, and suddenly I had to take over a business I barely understood. My mother was devastated. She couldn't help. Everything fell on me." He stood up and walked to the window, turning his back to Ava. "I met your mother during that dark period. Eleanor she was light, pure, simple, uncomplicated. With her I could forget for a moment all the weight I was carrying. But my mother didn't approve. She said I needed to focus, that distractions would destroy everything my father had worked for." "So you chose." "I chose wrong. I thought that if I just focused on the business, if I just worked hard enough, I could make my father proud from wherever he was. I didn't realize that in the process I was becoming the exact opposite of what he had been." He turned to Ava, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "My father would have been disappointed in me for how I treated your mother for abandoning you. He never would have done that. He never—" His voice broke. Ava watched as this powerful man crumbled before her, and she felt something soften inside her chest. "My mother would have been disappointed in you too," Ava said gently. "But she also would have wanted me to give you a chance. She always saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it." Richard looked at her with an expression of gratitude mixed with pain. What was she really like? Not the suffering, but her personality, what she liked. Ava smiled for the first time in days, remembering. She loved to sing. She had a terrible voice, completely off-key, but that never stopped her. She sang while she cooked, while she cleaned, while we walked down the street. She said music made any burden lighter. What did she sing? Mostly old romantic songs that her grandmother used to sing. Bésame mucho, unforgettable, things like that. Richard closed his eyes as if he could picture it. She liked to cook, even though we never had many ingredients. She could work magic with 3 things in the pantry. And she never complained. She never said life was unfair, or that I deserved more. She just did the best she could with what she had. She sounds like an incredible woman. She was. She was the strongest person I've ever known. And the kindest. She never spoke ill of you, you know? Even when she was dying, when she had every right to curse you, she just said, "He was young, life scared him. I hope he found his way." tears finally fell down Richard's face. I didn't find it, not until now. Not until you forced me to see it. A long silence followed. Outside, the first shadows of dusk began to stretch across the garden. Ava watched as the golden light illuminated Richard's face, highlighting every line of age, every mark of the decisions he had made. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said, finally wiping his tears. "Go ahead." "Do you think you can ever forgive me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and fraught with meaning. Ava considered her answer carefully. "I don't know. Forgiveness isn't something you can force or rush. But I'm still here. I'm here. That has to mean something." Richard nodded, accepting the answer with a grace Ava didn't expect. "It's more than I deserve." "Yes," Ava agreed. "It is." That night, as she prepared for bed in her room, no longer the staff quarters, but one of the guest rooms Richard had insisted she use, Ava looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was different from the one who had arrived at this mansion weeks ago. Her eyes were no longer filled with just rage and pain. Now, there was something else. Confusion, possibility, perhaps even hope. She wondered what her mother would say if she could see her now. Would she be proud, angry, relieved? "I wish you were here to tell me what to do, Mom," she whispered to the reflection. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing." But her mother wasn't there, and Ava would have to find her own way through this emotional labyrinth without her guidance. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into a month. The relationship between Ava and Richard continued to evolve, moving in waves of progress and retreat. There were good days when they could laugh together about something trivial, when Ava could almost forget the pain of the past. And there were bad days when every word, every gesture served as a reminder of all that had been lost. One morning, Richard surprised her with a proposal. "I want you to meet my mother, your grandmother." Ava choked on her coffee. "Your mother is alive?" "Yes. She lives in a retirement home just outside the city. She's 75, but still sharp as a tack." "And does she know about me?" Richard hesitated. "I told her a week ago. I needed to prepare her." "And what did she say?" "She wants to meet you. Although, I admit she's processing a lot of emotions. She was the one who pressured me to stay away from your mother, the one who said distractions would destroy the family business. I think she's realizing the weight of that now." Ava felt a mix of emotions, anger at this woman she had never met, but who had played a role in her abandonment, curiosity to meet the only grandmother she had left, fear of what that meeting might mean. "Okay, I'll meet her." The retirement home was elegant, like everything surrounding the Blackwood family. Perfectly manicured gardens, attentive staff rooms that looked like luxury hotel suites. Nothing like the public hospital where her mother had died. Ava's grandmother. It was still strange to think of her that way, lived in a spacious room on the 3rd floor. She was a small woman, stooped with age, but with piercing gray eyes that sized Ava up from the moment she entered. "So you're her?" the old woman said, her voice surprisingly strong for someone her age. "The secret daughter." "Mom," Richard began in a warning tone. "Let her speak," Ava interrupted, stepping closer. "I want to hear what she has to say." The old Mrs. Blackwood watched Ava for a long moment, her eyes moving over every detail of her face. "You look like him. Like my Richard when he was young. You have the same defiant eyes. And you look like someone who knows how to ruin lives from a distance." The silence that followed was tense. Richard paled, clearly expecting an explosion. But surprisingly, Mrs. Blackwood laughed. It was a dry, bitter, but genuine laugh. "You've got guts. Good. You'll need them if you're going to be part of this family. I'm not sure I want to be part of this family. No. Then why are you still here? You could have taken money and disappeared. You could have exposed Richard publicly. You could have done many things, but you stayed. Why? It was a good question. One Ava had asked herself many times in recent weeks. Because I wanted answers. And because maybe I wanted to see if he was worth having a father, even a terrible one. Mrs. Blackwood nodded slowly. My son is many things, but terrible isn't one of them. Cold, yes. Distant, definitely. But that was my fault, not his. She turned to Richard, who was looking at his mother with a surprised expression. After your father died, I was scared. Scared of losing the business he had built. Scared you weren't strong enough to handle it. So I pushed you. I pushed you to be tough, to show no weakness, to not let emotions cloud your judgment. And in the process, I turned you into someone neither your father nor I would recognize. Tears began to roll down the old woman's wrinkled cheeks. When you told me about this girl, about Eleanor, my first thought was defensive. I thought, this is a scam. Someone trying to take advantage of my son. But then I saw the proof. I saw your face when you spoke of her, and I realized what I had done. I didn't just rob you of your happiness, Richard. I robbed this child of her father. I robbed Eleanor of the love of her life. Mrs. Blackwood, Ava began, but the old woman held up a hand. Let me finish. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that if I could turn back time, if I could undo the damage I caused, I would do it without hesitation. Your mother deserved better. You deserved better. And my son deserved the chance to know you from the beginning. The silence that followed was different from the previous one, softer, more understanding. What was she like? Mrs. Blackwood asked finally. Your mother. Richard told me a little, but I want to hear it from you. And so Ava found herself telling stories about Eleanor, about her laugh, her off-key, singing her unshakable determination. Mrs. Blackwood listened, silent tears rolling down her cheeks, nodding occasionally, absorbing every detail. When Ava finished, the old woman extended a trembling hand. Ava looked at it for a moment before taking it. The hand was cold, fragile, the veins prominent under skin as thin as paper. Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood whispered. Thank you for sharing that with me, and thank you for giving my son a second chance. It's more than either of us deserves. When they left the retirement home, Richard was unusually quiet. Finally, when they reached the car, he turned to Ava. I've never seen her like that. I've never heard her admit she was wrong about anything. Maybe we're all learning to change, Ava replied. Even when it seems impossible. The change in the family dynamic became more evident over time. Richard began to include Ava in aspects of his life he had previously kept private. He took her to his office, showed her how his company worked, asked for her opinion on decisions he would never have shared before. One afternoon, while they were reviewing financial reports in his study, Ava noticed something in the papers. Charitable donations, she asked, pointing to a line. You never mentioned this. Richard shrugged, almost embarrassed. I started a few weeks ago, to public hospitals specifically, and to organizations that help single mothers. Ava felt her throat tighten. Because I can't help your mother now, but I can help women in similar situations. Maybe I can prevent other girls from growing up without their fathers like you did. Meh. It was a gesture that didn't change the past, but showed that Richard was trying to do something with his present as well. I also, Richard continued, pulling a folder from his drawer, set up a college fund in your name. You don't have to use it if you don't want to, but it's there. If you ever decide you want to study, the option is available. Ava took the folder with trembling hands. Inside were legal documents, numbers that made her dizzy. It was enough money to pay for any university she wanted, with plenty left over. This is too much. It's not enough. It will never be enough to make up for what you lost. But it's a start. Ava looked at the documents, then at Richard, then back at the documents. She had spent her entire life with no options, no possibilities, and now suddenly the world was opening up to her in ways she had never imagined. "I don't know what to study," she admitted. "I never let myself dream of college." "Then start dreaming now. You have time. There's no rush." That night, Ava stayed up late, researching universities on her laptop, another gift from Richard she had initially refused, but finally accepted. Literature, psychology, social work, art. So many options, so many possibilities. For the first time in her life, the future didn't seem like a burden to be endured, but a blank page waiting to be written. The days passed with a new routine. Richard cut back his work hours, spending more time at home. They started having regular dinners together, where they talked about everything and nothing: politics, philosophy, childhood memories, future plans. Slowly, they were building something that resembled a relationship. But there were still barriers. Ava still couldn't call him Dad. She still tensed up when he attempted gestures of physical affection. There were still moments where resentment bubbled to the surface, reminding her of everything she would never have, all the memories that would never be made. One rainy afternoon, they found photo albums of Eleanor that Ava had kept in her room. Richard found her looking at them in the library, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. "Can I sit?" he asked softly. Ava nodded, moving the album so he could see. "This was my high school graduation day," she explained, pointing to a photo of her in a cap and gown, her mother beside her, beaming with pride. "Mom worked double shifts for months to afford the graduation fee." Richard studied the photo intently. Eleanor looked older than she should have for her age, the hard work and illness already beginning to take their toll. But her smile was genuine, her pride in her daughter evident even in the photograph. "She looks happy," Richard observed. She was. That day she told me that I was her greatest achievement, that nothing she had done in her life made her prouder than seeing me walk across that stage. She must have been an incredible mother. She was, and you lost her by being a coward. The words were harsh, but Richard didn't flinch. Yes, I lost her, and I lost 23 years with you. Those are facts that will never change, no matter how much I wish they were different. They turned more pages together. Birthdays, budget vacations, to public beaches, everyday moments. Eleanor had faithfully documented an entire life, captured in photographs that Richard had never witnessed. "You know what the hardest part is?" Ava asked, after a long silence. "It's not just that you weren't there. It's that she loved you. Even after everything, even while she was dying, your name was the last thing she'd whisper in her dreams. And I would wonder, how can you love someone who hurt you so much?" "I don't know," Richard admitted, his voice broken. "But the fact that she could, that she chose to remember me with love instead of hate, that tells me more about her character than 1,000 words could." "It makes me angry," Ava confessed. "It makes me angry that she was so good, so pure, and that you didn't see it, that you let her go as if she meant nothing." "She meant everything to me. That's why I let her go. Because I was afraid that if I stayed, if I allowed myself to love her completely, I would become weak. I would become vulnerable. And at that point in my life, vulnerability seemed like the most dangerous thing in the world." Richard looked her directly in the eye. "Now I understand that the real weakness was running away from what I felt, that the real strength would have been to stay and face the consequences. Your mother was strong in a way I never was, and you inherited that strength." Ava felt something shift inside her, a small crack in the armor she had built around her heart. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was understanding. And maybe understanding was the first step toward something more. The weeks turned into 2 months. Life in the Blackwood mansion had developed an almost comfortable rhythm. Ava had started taking online classes, exploring different fields of study, while deciding what she wanted to do with her future. Richard had reduced his business trips to a minimum, turning down opportunities he once would have pursued without a second thought. But the past is never as far away as one might wish. One morning, as they were having breakfast together, a routine that had become sacred between them, Richard received a call that made his face turn pale. "I understand. Yes, I'll be there in an hour." When he hung up, his hands were trembling slightly. "What's wrong?" Ava asked. "It's my mother. She had a stroke during the night. The doctors say it's serious." The drive to the hospital was tense and silent. Ava watched Richard as he drove, seeing the anxiety in every line of his face. Despite everything Mrs. Blackwood had done, she was his mother, and the fear of losing her was real and palpable. At the hospital, they found the old woman connected to machines, her small body almost lost in the white bed. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. A doctor explained that she had suffered a massive stroke, that the next few days would be critical. Richard sat by his mother's bed, taking her fragile hand. Ava remained in the doorway, unsure if she should stay or go. "Stay," Richard said without looking at her. "Please." So she stayed. She watched as Richard spoke to his unconscious mother, whispering memories into asking for forgiveness for unspoken things promising to be better. It was painful to witness this powerful man reduced to a scared child at the prospect of losing his mother. "She's proud of you, you know," Ava said finally, "for trying to change." "How do you know? She told me the day I met her. Before we left, while you were talking to the doctor, she took my hand and said, 'Take care of him. He needs you more than he's willing to admit.'" Richard closed his eyes, tears escaping between his eyelids. "I'm not ready to lose her. Not now. Not after we just reconnected, just started to repair our relationship." Ava moved closer, and for the first time placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. It was a small but significant gesture. Sometimes we don't have control over the time, only over the present moment. They spent hours in that hospital. Doctors came and went with updates that swung between hopeful and devastating. Richard didn't move from his mother's bedside, holding her hand, talking to her, begging her to hold on. On the third day, Mrs. Blackwood opened her eyes. Her gaze was confused at first. Then it focused on Richard. A faint smile crossed her face. "My boy," she whispered in a hoarse voice. "I'm here, Mom. I'm here." The old woman's eyes moved to Ava, who was standing near the window. "And you brought your daughter?" "Yes, she's been here the whole time." Mrs. Blackwood gestured for Ava to come closer. Cautiously, Ava approached the bed. The old woman lifted a trembling hand and touched Ava's cheek with a tenderness that surprised them both. "You look so much like him. Like my husband, your grandfather. So I've been told. He would have been so proud to have a granddaughter like you." Tears rolled down Ava's cheeks. It was a strange feeling, this connection to people she had never met, to a family she had been denied for so long. "Take care of my boy," Mrs. Blackwood whispered, her voice weakening. "He seems strong, but inside, he's so fragile." "I will," Ava promised, surprised by her own words. Mrs. Blackwood closed her eyes, an expression of peace settling on her face. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, reassuring in its regularity. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Blackwood's recovery was slow but steady. The doctors called her improvement a miracle. Richard never left her side, working from the hospital, making business decisions from a chair beside his mother's bed. And Ava found herself being the bridge between the two, translating medical terms, organizing schedules, making sure they both ate and rested. Without realizing it, she had become part of this fragmented family, helping to put the pieces back together. One afternoon, when Mrs. Blackwood was asleep, Richard spoke to Ava in the hospital hallway. "I wouldn't have gotten through this without you. These last few days, I would have fallen apart." "You almost did anyway," Ava joked with a small smile. "I'm serious. You've been here helping taking care of us, and you didn't have to. We don't owe you anything after everything we did to you. Maybe I'm not doing it because you owe me something. Maybe I'm doing it because I'm starting to see that families are complicated, that people make mistakes, and that sometimes, just sometimes, those mistakes can be mended." Richard looked at her with an intensity Ava had learned to recognize. It was the look of someone who was truly seeing her not as an idea or a concept, but as a real person. "Does that mean—" "It means I'm still here. It means I haven't left. And it means that maybe with time, we can build something real. Not a perfect family, because that doesn't exist, but a real family." For the first time, Richard allowed himself to hug Ava. It was tentative, careful, giving her space to pull away if she wanted to. But Ava didn't pull away. She stood there in her father's arms, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to imagine what it would have been like if things had been different from the beginning. Mrs. Blackwood was discharged from the hospital after 3 weeks. Richard converted one of the mansion's living rooms into a ground-floor recovery room to save her from having to climb stairs. He hired private nurses and made sure she had everything she needed for a full recovery. To everyone's surprise, the near-death experience had softened the old woman considerably. She was no longer the cold, calculating matriarch she had been, but someone more reflective, more aware of the fragility of life and relationships. One afternoon, Ava found her looking out the window of her new room, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Can I keep you company?" Ava asked. "Please, sit." Ava settled into a chair by the bed. "How are you feeling today?" "Physically better. Emotionally." Mrs. Blackwood sighed. "When you're as close to death as I was, you start to reevaluate many things. The decisions you made, the words you said, the opportunities you wasted. Richard says you were always very strict with him. Too strict. After my husband died, I was so afraid. Afraid the business would fail, afraid Richard wasn't strong enough, afraid of losing everything we had built. And that fear turned me into someone hard, inflexible. I took away his chance to just be a young man with dreams and hopes. He doesn't blame you, you know. Not entirely. He should. Eleanor, your mother. When Richard first told me about her, I saw immediately that he loved her. Truly loved her. And instead of supporting him, of helping him find a balance between love and responsibility, I forced him to choose. I told him love would make him weak, that he needed to be ruthless to succeed. Tears rolled down the old woman's wrinkled cheeks. I was so wrong. Love wouldn't have weakened him. It would have strengthened him. It would have given him a real reason to work hard to build a future. Instead, I turned him into a cold machine that accumulated money but didn't know what for. Ava felt something soften in her chest. This woman who had played such a significant role in her abandonment was now before her completely vulnerable and repentant. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand that your father is not a bad man. He's a man who was shaped by circumstances, by loss, by my toxic influence. And if there's any hope for the two of you to build a real relationship, you need to know there were reasons for his decisions, even if those reasons don't justify the harm caused. I know. I'm starting to understand. Mrs. Blackwood took Ava's hand in hers, warmer now than the first time they had touched. I also need you to know something else. I've changed my will. A significant portion of my estate will go to you. Not because I think money can make up for what we took from you, but because you are my granddaughter. You are family, and families take care of each other even when they've failed terribly in the past. I don't need your money, Ava began, but the old woman interrupted her. This isn't about need. It's about right, about acknowledgement, about making sure that no matter what happens with Richard and me, you have security, you have options, you have the future your mother wanted for you but couldn't give you. Ava didn't know what to say. The emotions were overwhelming. Gratitude, sadness, confusion, hope, all mixed in a whirlwind that left her speechless. And there's something else, Mrs. Blackwood continued. Richard is planning an event, a charity gala, to raise funds for the hospital where your mother was treated. He wants to improve their facilities to ensure no other family has to watch a loved one suffer for lack of resources. He's doing it in Eleanor's honor. The tears finally fell. Ava had tried to hold them back, but it was too much. He really is changing, isn't he? Yes, and you're the reason. You woke him up from a cold, empty dream. You gave him a reason to be better, to be the man his father would have wanted him to be. Night at dinner, Richard officially told her about the gala. It will be in 3 weeks. I've invited the most influential business leaders in the city, celebrities, politicians. The goal is to raise at least $5 million for the hospital. That's incredible. And I want you there by my side. I want the world to know who you are and why this event is so important. Ava felt a knot in her stomach. The idea of being in front of all those people, of being the center of attention, terrified her. I don't know if I can do that. You don't have to give a speech if you don't want to. Just be there. Show that we're in this together, that we're honoring your mother together. The way he said it, with such hope and vulnerability, made it impossible for Ava to refuse. Okay, I'll be there. Richard smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face in a way Ava had rarely seen. Thank you. It means more than you can imagine. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. Richard was constantly on the phone, organizing details, securing donations, inviting important people. Ava watched him work with a dedication she had never seen in him, and she realized that when Richard committed to something, he did it completely. A stylist arrived with dresses for the event. Ava chose a dark blue one, elegant, but not too flashy. She practiced smiling in the mirror, mentally preparing herself for the scrutiny she knew she would face. The night before the event, Richard found her on the terrace looking at the stars. Nervous? He asked, coming closer. Terrified. Me too. I've given hundreds of speeches in my life, but this one is different. This one matters in a way none of the others ever have. They stood in silence for a moment, both looking at the night sky. Ava, Richard said finally, I know I can't call myself your father. I know I haven't earned that right, but I want you to know that I see you as my daughter, that when I think about my future, you are in it, and that I would do anything to ensure your happiness. Ava felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know what to say to that. You don't need to say anything. I just needed you to know. That night, Ava slept better than she had in months. And when she woke up the next morning, the day of the event, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of belonging, that maybe, just maybe, she had found her place in this strange and complicated world. The event hall was spectacular. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling tables decorated with exquisite flowers filled the space, and an imposing stage dominated one end of the room. Ava arrived early, with Richard watching, as the catering staff made last-minute adjustments and the musicians tuned their instruments. "It's beautiful," Ava whispered. "Nothing is too much to honor your mother's memory." The guests began to arrive. Men in perfect tuxedos, women in designer dresses that probably cost more than Eleanor had earned in a year. Ava watched them from a corner, feeling out of place, despite her elegant dress and professionally styled hair. Richard introduced her to person after person. Business leaders, philanthropists, local celebrities. They all smiled, shook her hand, said the right things, but Ava could see the curiosity in their eyes, the unspoken questions about who she really was and why she had appeared so suddenly in Richard Blackwood's life. As the room filled, Richard led Ava toward a group of his closest associates. In the center of that group, displayed on a velvet pedestal under a glass case, was the gold pocket watch. Ava's heart stopped. "I thought it would be appropriate to have it here tonight," Richard explained. "My father gave it to me before he died. It represents everything our family has built and everything I hope to pass on to the future." Ava stared at the watch, her hands beginning to tremble. From this distance, she could see the details she had examined that first time in the study. The intricate engravings, the gleam of the gold, the perfectly polished chain, and the inscription she knew was inside, "For my little star, who lit up my life when it was darkest." "It's beautiful, Richard," one of the guests commented. "A true family heirloom." "It is. My father had it specially made. It has a personal inscription that has always reminded me of where I come from and where I'm going." Ava felt as if she couldn't breathe. The ballroom suddenly seemed too small, too crowded, too suffocating. She needed air, she needed space, she needed... "Ava, are you okay?" Richard's voice seemed to come from far away. I need a moment." She walked away quickly, making her way through the crowd toward the balcony. Once outside, she inhaled deeply the cool night air, trying to calm her racing heart. That watch. That damned watch that had been on her mind since the first day she saw it. Now it was here displayed like a trophy, while hundreds of rich people drank champagne and congratulated each other on their generosity. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned. It was Richard, his expression worried. "What's wrong? Did I say something? The watch!" Ava interrupted, her voice trembling. "That watch! What about it? It's not just a watch. It's..." Ava closed her eyes, trying to find the words. "The inscription. My mother told me about it." Richard frowned, confused. "How could your mother know about the inscription? It's personal. My father had it made for me when I was a boy." "Are you sure about that?" "Of course I'm sure. He gave it to me on his deathbed. He told me it was to remind me that I was always his star, even in his darkest moments." Ava opened her eyes, looking at him directly. "My mother described that watch. In her last days, when the fever made her delirious, she would talk about a gold watch you always wore. She described the chain, the engravings, even the inscription. She said you showed her the inside once, that you told her how your father had it made for you." Richard paled. That's impossible. I never..." "Are you sure? Think, Richard. Think back to the moments you shared with my mother. Did you really never show her the most precious thing you owned?" She watched the color drain from his face as the memories slowly returned. His lips trembled, his eyes widened with recognition and horror. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Yes. I showed her the watch. It was on our last day together. I told her about my father, about the inscription, about what it meant to me. And she cried when I told her because she said it was beautiful, that a father could love his son so much. Tears began to stream down his cheeks. And then I left her. I left her right after sharing that with her. What kind of monster does that? The kind of monster who then displays that watch as a symbol of family heritage while his own daughter grew up without a father. Ava replied, her voice hard. Richard staggered as if she had physically struck him. I didn't see it that way. It was just my connection to my father. I never thought— Of course you didn't think, because you never thought about us, about what you took when you disappeared from our lives. At that moment, the balcony door opened. It was one of the event organizers. Mr. Blackwood, it's time for your speech. Richard looked at Ava, then at the organizer, then back at Ava. Sir, the guests are waiting. It's time to start the auction for the watch. Auction? Ava asked sharply. Richard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. I was going to auction it off to raise additional funds for the hospital. I thought it would be a meaningful gesture to give something so personal for such an important cause. Ava looked at him for a long moment, then without a word turned and walked back into the ballroom. Richard followed her panic, evident in his movements. As they entered, the MC was on stage announcing the main event of the night. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've all been waiting for. Mr. Richard Blackwood has generously offered to auction his family's most prized possession, a 19th-century gold pocket watch with a personal inscription. A true family treasure to be auctioned tonight, with all proceeds going to St. Joseph's Public Hospital. Applause filled the room. Richard went up to the stage, taking the microphone with trembling hands. Ava stood in the crowd, watching. Thank you. Thank you all for being here tonight. Richard began, his voice not as steady as usual. Before we begin the auction, there's something I need to say. Something that changes the meaning of this watch completely. The crowd's murmur subsided. All eyes were fixed on Richard. This watch belonged to my father. He gave it to me before he died with an inscription that I have always treasured. But I recently discovered that this watch is also part of another story, a story I was not aware of. He paused, searching for Ava in the crowd. Their eyes met, and Ava saw both fear and determination in his gaze. 23 years ago, I met an incredible woman, Eleanor Miller. I showed her this watch. I told her about the inscription. I opened my heart to her in a way I never had with anyone. And then I abandoned her. Gasps filled the room. Richard continued, his voice breaking. Eleanor was pregnant with my daughter, and I never knew because I was too much of a coward to stay. I was too selfish to face the consequences of my actions. The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. Eleanor raised our daughter alone. She worked until her body broke down. She fought cancer in a public hospital because she didn't have money for anything better. And she died 3 months ago, without ever receiving a cent of support from me, without ever hearing an apology, without ever knowing that I finally came to regret it. Tears were streaming freely down his face now. But her daughter, my daughter, she came to me. Ava found me. She confronted me. She forced me to see the monster I had become. And tonight, as we prepared to auction this watch, she realized something I was too blind to see. Richard walked to the pedestal, took the watch with trembling hands, and opened it to show the inscription to the crowd. For my little star who lit up my life when it was darkest. That's what it says. My father had it engraved for me. But now I realize, now I understand that these words have a completely different meaning. He turned toward Ava, stepping down from the stage and walking toward her through the silent crowd. He stopped in front of her, holding the watch between them. Ava, you are the star who lit up my life when it was at its darkest, when I was lost in a world of coldness and loneliness that I had created myself. You came and showed me what truly matters. You showed me that I had abandoned not just your mother, but myself. His voice broke completely. This watch doesn't belong to me. It never truly belonged to me. It belongs to you, because you are the true heir to its meaning. You are the star, and I was the coward who almost let you shine alone in the darkness. He held out the watch to her. Ava looked at it, then at him, then back at the watch. Her own tears were falling uncontrollably. "I don't want your watch," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I want my father." The entire room held its breath. "I want the father my mother saw in you before fear made you run. I want the man you could have been if you had chosen to stay. I want to know if it's still possible. If after all this time, all this pain, we can still be father and daughter." Richard let the watch fall. He didn't care if it broke. And he wrapped Ava in his arms. She clung to him, sobbing against his chest, releasing years of pain, anger, and longing. "Yes," he whispered into her hair. "Yes, it's possible. I promise you. I will spend every remaining day of my life being the father you deserve, the father your mother wanted me to be." The room erupted in applause, but neither Richard nor Ava heard it. They were lost in their own moment, finally connecting in the way they should have from the beginning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they separated. Richard picked up the watch from the floor, miraculously intact, and placed it in Ava's hands. "This is yours, not as an inheritance, but as a promise. A promise that from now on, you will be my star, and I will never ever let you shine alone again." Ava closed her fingers around the watch, feeling its weight, its history, its transformed meaning. "I accept your promise, Dad." It was the first time she had used that word. And when she did, she saw Richard's face light up with a joy that was impossible to fake. The rest of the night passed in a blur of emotions. The guests, moved by what they had witnessed, donated generously. Over $8 million was raised for the hospital. But for Richard and Ava, the numbers didn't matter. What mattered was that they had finally found their way back to each other. 3 months later, Ava stood in front of her mother's grave. It was a sunny day, the kind of day Eleanor had always loved. Beside her stood Richard, holding a bouquet of white lilies, Eleanor's favorite flowers. "Hi, Mom," Ava began softly. "I brought someone with me." Richard knelt carefully, placing the flowers on the headstone. His fingers traced the engraved name Eleanor Miller, 1975-2021. "Beloved Mother, Eternal Star." "Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling. "We never formally met, but I feel like I know you. Through Ava, through the stories she's told me, the values you taught her, the strength you gave her." He paused, gathering his courage. "I am so sorry I failed you. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. I'm sorry you had to raise our daughter alone. I'm sorry you died without knowing that I finally woke up, that I finally understood what I lost when I let you go." Tears rolled down his cheeks, but he continued. "But I want you to know something. I am doing everything I can to be the father Ava deserves, the man you saw in me when we were young, before fear turned me into a coward. I am trying to honor your memory by being better, by being real." Ava knelt beside him, taking his hand. "She would have liked you, Mom. I know you would have given him another chance. You always believed in giving people second chances." They stayed there in silence for a long moment, the two of them united in their grief and their love for the woman who had connected their lives in ways they had never imagined. When they finally stood to leave, Ava looked back one last time. "I love you, Mom. And thank you for teaching me how to forgive. For showing me that even the most broken stories can find their way to something beautiful." In the months that followed, Ava's life changed in ways she could never have anticipated. She enrolled in college, studying social work, determined to help other families facing the struggles she and her mother had endured. Richard established a foundation in Eleanor's name, providing financial and medical support to single mothers and their children. Mrs. Blackwood, fully recovered from her stroke, became a constant presence in their lives. She spent hours with Ava, telling her stories about the grandfather she never knew, teaching her about the family history, trying to make up for lost years. The gold watch found a new home, a special display case in Ava's room where she could see it every day. It was no longer a symbol of abandonment or pain. It had become a reminder that people can change, that families can heal, and that even in the darkest times, stars find a way to shine. One evening, 6 months after the charity event, Ava and Richard were sitting on the terrace, watching the stars. It was something they had started to do regularly, just sitting together without the need for words, enjoying the peace they had found. "What are you thinking about?" Richard asked finally. "About how quickly lives can change. A year ago, I was planning my mother's funeral, wondering how I would go on. 6 months ago, I hated you. And now—" Ava looked at him, a small smile on her lips. "Now I have a father, a grandmother, a family, a future. Things I never thought I'd have." "Me too," Richard admitted. "I spent decades building an empire, accumulating wealth, chasing success. But I was empty. I had nothing real. And then you arrived, and suddenly everything has meaning, everything has purpose. Mom would have been happy to see us like this." "Yes, I think she would." They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence, full of mutual understanding and peace. "Dad," Ava said finally, testing the word, savoring her growing comfort with it. "Thank you. For changing. For trying. For proving that it's never too late to make things right." Richard reached out his hand, and Ava took it. Sitting there under the stars, father and daughter finally at peace, they both understood something fundamental. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still unwritten. And this time, they would write it together. Years later, when Ava had her own children, she would tell them the story of her mother Eleanor, of her courage, her strength, her unwavering love. She would tell them about their grandfather Richard, and how a cold, distant man learned to love. She would tell them about a gold watch with an inscription that changed lives. And she would tell them that no matter how dark the night may seem, there are always stars waiting to shine. You just need to have the courage to look up and let them light your way. The watch kept ticking, as it always had, but now each tick, each tock was not a reminder of time lost, but a celebration of time gained, of second chances of love finding its way through the darkness. And somewhere, Ava wanted to believe Eleanor was looking down with a smile, proud of the woman her daughter had become, proud of the man Richard had managed to be, proud of the family that had finally found itself. Forgiveness was never easy, and healing took time, but both were possible. And that was the only thing that truly mattered. Under the stars that night, father and daughter held on to each other, not as strangers trying to build something from scratch, but as family. A family that had been broken and mended, imperfect, but real. A family that had learned that true love always finds its way back home. and in that they found their own star of hope shining eternally in the night sky of their transformed lives. If you liked this video, please give it a like, subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends, and leave your opinion in the comments. Your support helps us continue to create more content like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications to stay updated on our next exciting story.